All right, I have with me again, you're James Benton. He's the host of the Meaning Forge on YouTube. He's also a frequent guest of many Christian and atheist conversations. He's been on my podcast several times, but this is your first time doing video. So thank you, James, for agreeing to do this. We just did an hour discussion about me, and now we're going to kind of piggyback off where we left off when you came up to the house a few months ago, and we were having this big discussion on meaning and all the different things on that one. And we decided to try to see where the ideas are now, considering I've started watching John Vervaeke's Meaning Crisis, or Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and some of the connections.
I have a question there. Would you have watched Jonathan Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis if it wasn't for the Jordan Peterson interview?
I was going to get to it eventually. I was going to, no, seriously. See, you guys might see me doing stuff with my chair, but this chair sinks with me in it. I'm not very tall, and so if I'm looking up at the mic, then you know the chair has sunk. No, I was going to get there eventually, but the Jordan and John talk facilitated expediting getting to it, because I remember what was it? There was a tweet from Jordan about John Vervaeke as his colleague at the University of Toronto, and I was like, all right, I'm going to go and check this guy's YouTube channel out. And you had mentioned watching the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series, and that I should watch it. And I said, okay, and I'll get it when I get a chance. I'll do that. And then, now that I have an hour-long commute to and from, to work, and an hour from work, I can basically sit and listen to John Vervaeke's lecture series as part of my work commute. And so,
absolutely, and it's a really good series. It's loaded and it's dense, but you walk away, I think, really learning a lot. So that's just me. And I think when I first mentioned it to you, I said something to the effect of, you can't do Vervaeke without doing Peterson, and you can't do Peterson without Vervaeke in some regards, because the way they talk and the way they interact is so it's amazing, right? Like it really is a testament to like synchronicity and some other stuff, right? Because like you can literally start to see how these two entities are operating. And I think Vervaeke, he comes again from a more, I would say, philosophical, cognitive science background, and genuine like seeker of truth, or something to that effect. And then you have Jordan Peterson, who's coming from I would say, the mythological Jungian perspective, of course, psychologist, and they really complement one another.
Oh yeah,
like, really well. Like I can't stress how well they complement.
Yeah, I mean, that conversation that they had. Jordan's always talked about having this manic temperament when it comes to when he's talking to people, and he's really enjoying the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And you really actually saw that. There was a lot of times that you wish Jordan wouldn't interrupt and just let John go, but you can also tell that Jordan's got a thought there, and he's trying to get it out there before he loses it. So
absolutely. And the thing with John's stuff is, it's sad, but it's true. You have to know Jonathan Vervaeke's work a little bit, at least be somewhat familiar with it, before you can really, I think, take some of the stuff that he says and go, oh, that's what you're talking about. Like, yeah. I mean, his vocabulary. I first stumbled across Jonathan Vervaeke working through Paul Vanderklay and Jonathan Bugeaud. And for me, Jonathan Vervaeke literally makes his own vocabulary for some like these ideas like expectation, psychotechnology, and it's completely changed how I see. And I'm a Christian, right? And it completely changes how I see religion. It
Mhm.
completely changes how I see the mind. I mean, just so many different things. And even philosophy, because he does a really good job of outlining philosophy and how the scientific and philosophical advancements, which you're getting through the first 25 episodes or so, uh, undercut the meaning crisis.
Yeah, it lays out exactly. I think it lays out how we got to the meaning crisis. It's like a
Yes.
roadmap to it, and then I'm assuming the second half then is addressing the meaning crisis. That's what are we going to do about it, kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. He has his idea of how he wants to address it. Um, but that's I don't know if he alludes to it in the first episode. He talks more about like relevance realization. I'll
Hmm.
save that for later, but that is that's a whole other thing. And replacing credo, like creed, like the creed aspect, which we know from Young, right?
Hmm.
Um, church, when it becomes a creed, it becomes bad. Um,
Yeah, that's part of the reasons why Jung broke away
yep,
from Freud was because of that dogmatism,
yep, exactly.
the psychosexual
Yep,
development theory that Freud had, and said that the what was it? He said the sexual theory has to be dogma in psychoanalytic theory, and that's when Jung was like, yeah, no, not cool, not cool.
exactly. And so like, it gives us that. Uh, he talks about that and replacing like don't let religion subserve creed. It's something about like religio, and I have to kind of go back to my notes to that idea on that topic, but it's helping it to serve your relevance realization landscape, and how the four ways of knowing come into play, and how you can rack and stack with those, and help enter into higher states of consciousness, which alluded to by the flow state.
Yes,
um
and that's what
so
Peterson means when the left and right hemispheres of the brain are
mhm.
in sync with one another with what you're doing. That signals to you that what you're doing is meaningful because you enter into that flow state. And so this is where I think where we're going to talk about how maps of meaning
Yes.
and the awakening from the meaning crisis, and how they tend to lay on top of one another in an almost synchronous fashion.
Hmm.
And I think it's interesting too, and this is where I said like the narrative world touches the objective world in a sense, is because I'm also reading Existential Psychotherapy by Irvin Yalom, and Irvin Yalom was an existential psychotherapist and
Hmm.
psychiatrist. And there's things that Yalom states it's kind of part of that, but there's also some things there that I don't think I agree with Yalom on, insofar that he was influenced by Jean-Paul Sartre. And I'm not a big fan of Sartre's by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not
Hmm.
familiar enough with his work, but from what I've read about Sartre, I'm just not too thrilled about him. So I guess the first thing that really stuck out with me is this idea of salience or relevance, right? He uses a little bit of talking about salience, things that are salient, things that are they're
So I
in the
so I
story.
have a small confession. I have not finished Maps of Meaning, but when I
Book
did
or the lectures.
the lectures and the book, but I have read the first few chapters and whatnot.
Okay.
And I'm gonna tell you right now, like when you talk about salience, right? That's within the first few chapters. It like literally like there's moments where you read that and you go, Jonathan Vervaeke's talking about this too.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like how you interact with the world, and you're saying, and the arena agent relationship, and how important that is, to get an optimal grip on your surroundings, or on a cup or something like that, and on the problem, and solve it, or along those lines.
Yeah,
So it's
salience,
really
salience and relevance are I think they're interchangeable words because when something's salient, it's relevant to the discussion. It adds to the discussion, or it adds to whatever it is that is bringing it. It adds to that's in the world. So like we're talking about meaning, and so you know, and this is kind of where you kind of warned me about this being kind of dangerous territory. But there's some things in here that are predicated on what even Jung was talking about in his later years. Like for example, I was reading what was it? The development of personality papers on child psychology, education, and other works. And one of the things that Jung was talking about is that when you're trying to develop, this is where he talks about Christ and Buddha as complete personalities, because basically the development of the personality is the process in which you become an individual in the world and act in the world and not an agent of the world. And so instead of just kind of going through the motions like some sort of pre-programmed, robot that, okay, you're born, you're a child, you do things, you become an adolescent, you do things, you become an adult, you do things, and then you die and rinse and repeat. That people like Buddha, Christ, were people who were developed enough that they weren't just acting in the world like everyone else, but they acted apart from the world in a way that left an impact on the world. And so, so Jung thought that was the meaning of life, was to become an individuated, developed personality, as opposed to just being a part of the world, but you had to be a part from the world within the world, if that makes any sense.
Yes. Yeah. So my pad's working now, by the way.
Your pad?
My little pad thing's working. All right. So we have a few different things here, and I'll draw some of this out, and I can share my screen.
Okay.
So salience and relevance, I think we have to make sure that we're using the terms appropriately and not trying to equivocate too much.
Okay.
Because I think in order to determine, because the reason why I say that is because if we look at a problem set, right, and we have one, we have limited capacity to actually determine out of the infinite number of propositions to actually solve that problem, right? That's why we can always do something better. Okay. At that given moment in given time, maybe 5 of those propositions have come up that are salient to what's going on, or that come up to our salient, like that get noticed, right? Now, relevance then, and I really hope I'm not butchering Vervaeke's work or anything like that, is identifying which of those propositions are the best, or something like that.
Okay, so to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly, because like I said, salience, relevance, they're relatively new terms. So salience is, let's say that they're overall, that's the overall relation of all these different propositions to solve the problem, right? So all these different possible solutions, they're related to the problem. That's their salience. But the best propositions, or the best solutions to said problem, they're the most relevant to said problem. So that's where their relevance comes from, is that they're the most closely related solutions to a problem, rather than being the overall relationship of solutions to a problem. Is that correct?
One step further along the line, right? And so, like, I think I think we're minor semantic differences or something like that. What I would say is, our salience landscape, right, is in our agent arena relationship, right? And so when we sit here and we have a problem set, these ways to solve these propositions become salient. Like they start to emerge.
So they have a closer relationship to the problem than anything that's outside that field, or that field of salience, correct?
You might have to rephrase that.
Okay, so you said you have a set of problems, and then you have a set of propositions, or a set of proposed solutions, right? Okay, so salience is the sum total of solutions to the problem as they're related to that, right?
I guess that's the way to look at it, because you're seeing it as a sum total.
Okay,
Okay.
because there could be solutions to other problems, but they're not related to this particular set of problems, so they're
Yeah.
not salient. They're just kind of there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah. And so like you have like
we're-
saliency, and then like this is like what you're made aware of,
yeah.
right? Like immediate, like it's like maybe step one.
Step
right?
one, what are the possible solutions
Yep.
to set problem? Okay, relevant
Yep.
would be okay. Well, what's the most likely? What are these are the propositions or solutions that are most likely to to solve problems, right?
Yep. And then you have relevance realization, right?
And that
And
would
what
be
that does
would
is
that be the implementation?
that is the no, that is identified right problem and then implementation.
So you've identified the proper solutions in relationship to the
Yes.
problem, and then the next step after that is the implementation of solution to problem.
Yes.
So if we're going to talk about this from say like a maps of meaning perspective, then what it is okay, you see the world and you have anomaly, right? So you've identified the anomaly is not so much the promise or let's say you have okay, so you have planned pattern of behavior and you come across an anomaly. So there's a promise of progressing forward, and there's also this fear, anxiety of threat. So if it's not the promise of progress, but you're going to look at say like, okay, we have this anomaly, we have this anxiety, things aren't going to go the way we want it to. So then as you've come to this problem, you look at all the different ways that you could try to solve this said problem. So that's the salience. You've identified all the possible solutions to said problem. Then relevance is looking at the solutions that are going to have the highest probability of solving said problem to move you forward. Then that relevance realization is picking the solution that's going to best solve the problem in a way that works the way you expect it to, so that way you can move forward in the world. And then the implementation is the acting out the new planned set of behavior that's going to solve said problem, move you back from point A to point B.
Yep. And so the key thing though with the implementation, so if we look at this as a system, right? Like let's look at this. I'm gonna go ahead and just kind of share my screen here.
Okay.
You have disabled screen sharing.
Okay, let me see if I can enable that somehow.
Because I'm just gonna kind of just draw this out real quick. This comes later, by the way. This comes much later in the Vervaeke series. Like you start getting into this after around episode 30. As far as relevance realization and whatnot. And I think my concern is I don't want to.
Is it it's not okay.
You're good. I don't want to shortchange Vervaeke's idea or miscommunicate his ideas, because I'm not gonna say they're complex. He communicates them very simply and very elegantly. There is though a lot of kind of simple, but then they come together and like how do those things interact? And it comes a rather large list. In the meantime, you're figuring that out.
Yeah, I really.
You're good.
Why won't you? Okay, so okay, I can make you host, and now you should be able to share your screen.
Okay. Oh man. Share screen. And it is screen 3.
There we go. Okay, cool.
Okay. So this is rudimentary. So like, and we kind of I like, let me just outline where we are now. Like, so we have proposition of whatever, right? Like we're trying to solve. So P1, P2, P3, P4, right? Of a problem set that we've identified is, I guess, relevant to or salient in solving whatever it is, right? And that's kind of demonstrated relevance here, right? And so relevance realization, there's a bunch of things that come into it. Communication, intelligence. There's a few other things that are listed, and then it goes through this best choice apparatus, which we don't always know is going to work or not. And the reason why we don't always know it's going to work through implementation is because of forces like self-deception.
That's either saying, well, the problem isn't as bad as it is, or that you've made yourself believe the problem is worse than it actually is.
Yeah, it's there's several of these things. Hang on. So self-deception, like deep remembrance. That's not really. There's a structural issue. There could be structural issues with it. But again, relevance realization is not foolproof. It is a method. It's essentially this thing that we're picking the best proposition of these, and then we implement it. That's why we're never always right. And then we start going through RR, and we have self-deception, we have structural modality issues. My notes now I feel like are completely underwhelming because it's been a while since I've reviewed it. And so we have to also overcome all of these things like on this side as well, which again, he's attempting to make a system, a system of that's somewhat reliable by attacking this kind of on two sides and making sure that we have good problem solving, problem identification, rational thought. And then also like we have ability to overcome like self-deception. We have the ability to identify good structural procedures. Again, this is directly from some of my notes here. So like overcome the reflectiveness gap, which is the idea that if I could reflect, I start reflecting here on some problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I reflect on that. So I reflect times 2, and then I'm reflecting again. This is captured by Hamlet, actually, like by in Shakespeare's Hamlet, because he's always reflecting, and so there becomes this gap, and you have to cut this off quickly. Like you can't, like you still have to make a decision, like because you're always reflecting, and it just doesn't work. And then on top of that, you have like parasitic processes. And so this could be considered a parasitic process. A parasitic process could be, I am not worthy. Like you have a negative thought, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then this negative thought leads to another negative thought, and then it leads to another negative thought.
It goes into that feedback loop of negative thoughts, negative actions, maladaptive behavior. And you see a lot of this in like, say, like anxiety disorders, panic disorder, things of that nature, where you have a negative, and like you've drawn what looks like to be a spiral there. It does spiral down into this thing that ends up.
And that's a way of looking at it, but it's a parasitic process because they all feed off of one another, and so we have to be able to break. We have to be able to break this parasitic process. We have to be able to break these things, even on the other side of implementation, and still maintain, I guess, in some ways, a higher state of consciousness, a HSC.
And so, say from a clinical perspective, then let's say, okay, you have a problem set that's one of those things that life just kind of throws at you, right? Kicks the knees out from under you. It could be the death of a parent, death of a child, something traumatic, right? And so then you, of course, you have your propositions to the problem set here. And so a person might pick the wrong proposition that say it's not as relevant to solving the problem as it could be. And then this is where you have the deception, right? That's the, well, we're going to do this and it should make things better, but you obviously know that it's not going to, but you do it anyway. And it feeds into this maladaptive cycle, this parasitic. What did you call it? A parasitic
parasitic process. Yes.
Okay, so we could call this, just a positive feedback loop of negative emotion, negative thoughts, and then what those actions are that are associated with that.
And there's a lot to this, but RR sits in the middle of this, and this I have to kind of actually spend some more time on my notes, but I think that this is probably an aspect of kind of like this again of what I highlighted here, because the thing is, relevance realization is more, it's a higher state of consciousness, it's wisdom, or like it's virtue, because if I'm not mistaken, so you finished the Plato episode. So the Plato episode talks about the lion, the man, and the monster.
Yeah, the lion, the man, the monster. And so if I remember this correctly, man is considered like the top part of the human being. That's the rational mind. That's man. Monsters like the base instincts, and the lion is the person itself. And he talks about the history of that going back with Freud, with the three-tiered model of personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. The superego being man, the ego being the lion, and the monster being the id, which are the instincts.
Yeah. Well, I guess what I would take away here is the big takeaway for me, especially as you start going into the next, is you're creating a virtual engine.
I remember talking that the virtual engine is kind of predicated on like virtues, or that's where or virtues part of that.
Well, yeah, and so you have constraining factors, constraining, and then enabling.
Yeah, you can look at that as morality, that you constrain what would you consider the bad behaviors, you enable the good behaviors, and if you do that at the individual level.
Yep, you can, but what this does is it creates, again, like it's a methodology for keeping RR right accurate or optimized is really probably the best word.
When you say R, you mean the R
relevance realization.
Relevance realization.
RR. And so this is the kind of the framework by which, because over a series of a few lectures, the way that he does this, it's like episodes 30 through like 40, is he'll look at this side of the problem set, which is mostly problem framing. And intelligence, some intelligence type stuff, and a few other things. And then he'll look at this side of the equation, because he's trying to make this scientific, repeatable to the best that he can. And this is actually the reverse enlightenment episodes, or reversing the enlightenment. I'm left-handed, everybody, so you have to forgive my shitty handwriting.
Oh no, it's perfectly fine. You're probably write better than I could with, and I'd probably be using paint because I've never used OneNote before. So
you're good. And so you inverse enlightenment, and what you're doing is you're getting at some transcending yourself, You're overcoming biases and a few other things. And then in the middle, oddly enough, there's this engine, right? Where you want to be, you're messing with higher states of consciousness. You're talking about wisdom and what wisdom is, because intelligence is not the only answer to
Mm.
solving what's relevant. Actually, Vervaeke says in it, he looks at a study, and he talks about rationality too. Rationality and intelligence is a 0.3 correlation.
Yeah, they're not really highly correlated at all.
Exactly. And so, and there's this, that being said, intelligence alone is not enough to get you. So you need wisdom. Like you need like this optimizing engine, and how you frame problems, and then how you overcome self-deception, and how you reverse enlightenment principles, and get to relevance realization. Now, I will say this as well, and this is a critique of many followers of Vervaeke, that this has somehow become cultish in some regards, like relevance realization. I would be very careful with that. Again, he's trying to come up with a system that helps understand these problem sets. And so, um, again, it's a system that now I feel woefully unprepared for. Uh,
No, it's
but
fine.
it's good though. It's good.
Well, I mean, okay, so let's see. I wonder if I can share.
Yeah, let me cancel my share real quick.
And I guess you'll have to.
Came over here. Okay. We should both be.
No, you're gonna have to make me host again.
Dude. Put you in the waiting room. Should be a way to make you a co-host. Hang on one second. Let me mess around for a second. Allow recording. Put in waiting room. I hope you didn't lose the recording.
No, it's still recording.
Okay. Oh, it's under participants. That's
Yeah.
where. That's probably where it is.
Yeah, should be able to like highlight my name. This should be mute more.
Okay, I forgot how to. Yeah. I'm gonna make you the host, but I forgot how to do the co-host thing.
I don't know how to do that either. I wish I knew how.
That's okay. It's okay.
Okay. So let's see here. Go Chrome. No. Okay. So this is. Do you recognize this from
Yes.
Maps of Meaning? Okay.
Yes.
So we can look at this as like what is, right? The unbearable presence. So that would be, I would say, the same as the problem set, right? What is the unbearable presence? So I would say the salience, that's the propositions, right? So those are different planned sequences of behavior. And so you want predicted outcome rather than unpredicted outcome, let's say in the face of anomaly, right? So predicted outcomes are hope, pleasure, and promise, right? And if what you're doing in relationship to that problem set works for you, then you continue that sequence toward what should be. That's your ideal future. However, if what your relevance realization implementation, when it doesn't work, that takes you to the unpredicted outcome. That's threat, that's anxiety, and that leads to what Peterson would say. That's when you're down in the chaos, because what you were wanting to do isn't working the way you want it to, and so you have to learn from that. So I guess that's that. What would you say? Would you say that's that process of maybe relevance realization, insofar that it's okay, this we're realizing that the first proposition didn't work, so we need to figure out a plan action of behavior that would work.
Yeah, okay, that would work too. But I would also go as far as to say you have constraining and enabling behaviors, right?
Yeah.
And so if you create this system, and some of these things don't work out or something like that, like you go through complexification, right? And
Mhm.
then that boils down and it collapses on itself a little bit. And so you kind of go through some of these cycles, and
So
that can help you.
the collapse. Would you say the collapse is probably another metaphor for this idea of the chaos of the unknown, which is also a metaphor for
Yes.
the underworld, right?
Yes. I would attribute that to a like the collapse, or even enabling, right? Like the enabling aspects. And the reason why I would attribute that is because chaos is when you have a lot of different, like you have, for
That's
example,
where
pull.
that's where
What?
you are when you don't know what's going on, when things are just falling apart
Yes.
around you. That's when that's the unknown.
Yes, and the enabling factors are unknown in some regards, and because it's chaotic, because now you again, like you've collapsed, and now you have all of these new opportunities,
Right.
right? And so you have to start like you start complexifying again. It doesn't mean you go through all of the different ones. You start reconstraining yourself and establishing that ordered process aimed at whatever it is that you're aimed at.
And so that would be the reintegration and ascent from the underworld back into,
Hmm.
say, the real world. And then that's when you would act out that planned sequence of behavior, and you either get the expected outcome or the unexpected outcome. And
Yeah.
then it's that process that happens again continuously. And if you keep making the wrong decisions, and that, like you said, that could be enabling behavior. That's when you get into that
Mhm.
parasitic process of negative thoughts, negative emotions, and then behaviors predicated on that. Then you're just continuously you're descending and ascending in and out of the underworld all the time. And that's,
Yes.
like I said, that's at the, if you look at it clinically, then that's, you could say that this is a metaphorical map of, when things are going well, and then what it's like if you're in this constant loop of descent and reintegration, disintegration and reintegration, then that feedback loop, that's like I said, anxiety disorders are heavily predicated upon that. And so I would say then what Vervaeke has done, I think, is, and I want to be very careful here, but it seems to me that there's a lot of some of the principles of reality therapy are kind of present here. So you tell me what you think about this, because this is how I think about it, is from the philosophical foundations of like different therapies here. So Glasser's idea is that people don't necessarily get depressed, but people depress themselves. They put themselves in this negative, in this parasitical process, this negative,
Mhm.
this negative emotion, this positive feedback loop of negative emotion, negative thoughts. And so what he does to help, what would you say, what the reintegration or the making things more complex, is it's like, okay, what is it that you want or that you need? Right. So that's saying,
Mhm.
okay, well, what would be the ideal future if the present right now is unpleasant, right? So what is it that you want or you need? What are you doing right now to try to get that, right? So then you're posing so you're looking at the problem set of, okay, you have a
Yeah.
want or a need, and you obviously haven't got that. So that's the problem set. So then you're looking at salience, right? That's all the different uh, you would say that's the propositional set of different solutions to said problems. So that's you looking at what are you doing right now, and how is that working for you to
Mhm.
get what you want or what you need, right? And then
Yeah. Yeah, because he often uses, so when Vervaeke uses salience, he uses it like with another word, right? He always says like salient. He typically always says like salience landscape, right? So he's looking out, and like you
so
see
a
the.
salience landscape would be the set of the sum total set of solutions to said problems. So that's the
Okay.
sum total set of behaviors that you could act out or that you're acting out to get what you need.
Hmm.
And if it's not working for you, then you want to find the most relevant. So you want to look at relevance in relationship to what you want or what you need. What are those behaviors that you could act out the behaviors that you can embody and act out and try to get what you want or need that might be more successful to you. And so you have to pick from one of those patterns of behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And then so
Yep.
what you've done is you've decided, you've figured out what your wants and needs are. You've evaluated what you're doing.
Yep.
You're now evaluating new patterns of behavior, or you're evaluating how that's working out for you, which you can say it is or it isn't. And if it isn't, then you're in the P stage, which is planning out new patterns of behavior to try to get what you want or what you need. And so that's like one of the primary things when it comes to reality therapy. In as far as now Glasser, of course, that's a oversimplification of a way of getting to that. But Glasser thought of it as most of the problems that people have is because they deny the reality that they're in. They reality is so bad that you try to deny that and warp that. And what that does is that warps your perceptions, your emotions, your motivations for action. It warps your actions. And then you start getting into, like you said, that parasitic process. And that's part of that denial of reality kind of thing. So it's like, okay, you have to admit the reality that you're trying to do away with, that you're trying to ignore. You're trying to be willfully blind to the reality around you. And what you want is in the real world. So you have to acknowledge the real world, acknowledge what it is that you're actually wanting to do, and then how are you going to get that? Because what you're doing right now isn't working the way it's supposed to. And that's also predicated in choice theory, which is, freedom of choice. You have the freedom to choose your behaviors to in relation to your wants. And that, I think that's really at the, I want to say, the absolute cornerstone of existential philosophy, or at least insofar as existential philosophy influences psychotherapy, is that it's you have there's a freedom here. You have a freedom to choose. You have the freedom of choice of the salience landscape in relationship to a set of problems. You have the freedom of choice in which solutions are the most relevant to said problem. You have freedom of choice in what you're going to make the most relevant when it comes to relevance realization. You have a freedom of choice in how you're going to implement that. You have the freedom of choice of how you're going to react to the consequences of implementing that. And then so you're responsible for yourself insofar as you're responsible for the choices that you make, and you're responsible to others and how those choices affect the outcomes as it might affect other people. And so so when you get into the state of meaning or the state of flow, that's your fit. That's a physiological sign that what you're doing is working. It's working the way it's supposed to, and it's putting you in the state that's absolutely the most meaningful. And that's how it relates to responsibility. I know that's a lot that I just kind of laid out there, but I want to see
There's
what
a
you make.
lot there.
But I want to see what you make of that.
I think from a general perspective, there's something there, right? But I'm trying. I'm something about it doesn't sound right. I can't put my finger on it.
Is it because I'm coming at it from like a therapeutic perspective, or is it because I'm taking from?
It could be a perspectival clash. It could very well be that. I just don't like. I'm just trying to. I think one of the things in this conversation, and I'm so like I'm aware of it because I've been exposed to the community, is I don't want to misinterpret anyone's ideas, and that's kind of my thing. And so like, I think I think you're on it in some regards. I just don't know where you're not.
Okay.
And following that train of thought, I agree with you. I think that makes sense. And I'm also trying to make sure I understand how Vervaeke is using salience. Because maybe that's the issue, right? Maybe that's the issue for me, because like maybe I'm using it wrong, because he does use his own vocabulary, and I think it's frustrating, right? But it's useful because it helps us see what he's trying to say.
Yeah, because like relevance, for example, for
Mhm.
the lay person that's not, I would okay, so what's the right way of thinking about this, because I don't want to insult anybody here, but when you hear the word relevance, you think of things that are relevant, things that are related to the topic at hand. And it seems to me, and you can tell me if you think I'm wrong here, but it seems to me when we're talking about relevance in relation to a problem set, that it is the most relevant and the most likely solutions to a problem that are going to have the highest probability of working statistically.
Yeah, because the idea is if you achieve relevance realization, right, you're able to solve the problem, or at least able to get a new set of problems, just to some extent, right?
Yes.
And the thing that makes this complicated, and I would be happy to say it, maybe it's on my end as well, because the way that we go about looking at this is there's what goes into it, and then there's like this little process which is relevance realization in and of itself, and
Mhm.
then there's another subordinating process. It's literally a chain of events that happens, and you have to, in some ways, right, it kind of goes back to like what you were saying earlier. You're part of the world but you're not part of the world. In a way, I kind of see that as you have to be able to go across the spectrum, while you achieve a level of mindfulness where you see both sides of the equation and what makes up the middle.
Yes, see that's an interesting thing too. The mindfulness aspect that
Yes.
Vervaeke talks about to me, and this is kind of where this is going back, because I've read and watched the Maps of Meaning book. I've read it. I've watched the
Mm-hmm.
lectures like more times than I can count. So being mindful is like what Peterson says about the ability to pay attention,
Mm-hmm.
being able to pay
Oh yeah.
attention to what's going on around you and what's going on within you and that's the ability to pay attention. That's the motif of the eye, the eye of Horus. That's the motif there. And so, I don't think at this point Vervaeke or Peterson would be talking past one another. They're just using different, I would say, different grammar. Because I
Yeah,
think,
and you see that in the interview a little bit too, and that's why you see Jordan asking so many different questions, and I would even say for Vervaeke making lots of not concessions towards an argument or anything like that, but like trying to be cognizant of, so like, his audience, and trying to um, meet them halfway, or something like
yeah,
that, to that effect.
yeah, because like you said, Peterson stays mostly psychological, or Vervaeke
Mm-hmm.
in the philosophical cognitive science and cognitive
Yeah.
science and psychology here.
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of, what would you say? They're kind of like overlap a bit, but there's also a little bit of divergence. So they might overlap more
Exactly.
of something kind of like this, where they have stuff they have in common, but there's a lot of stuff that they don't exactly have in common either.
Yeah, from the philosophy stuff, like spot on. And then on top of that, what's the objectives of both of them too? Um,
Cognitive science, I think, is an
oh,
empirical
I'm just
and
talking about
purely.
yeah,
Oh, okay. So we're
like
not talking about the
Vervaeke.
objectives of say like cognitive science
Mm-hmm.
versus say psychology. We're talking
We're talking about the people,
of the
right?
people.
And so like, and for Vervaeke, like, he's trying to, because he sees this from a, like, there's a meaning crisis and stuff like that. Well, how do you find meaning? And there's a relevance aspect to this, because like, so I'm going to preface this too, right? Because he
Okay.
prefaces it. And I think Jordan Peterson should preface it, especially with Sam Harris, right? Because it was in their talk where they were talking about meaning a little bit, and he's like, "Just give me the quick answer." And Jordan Peterson's like, "Well, I can write a 40, I can give a 40 lecture series, or write a huge book about the topic." Um, Here's the bottom line: anyone who talks about these topics, these are not straightforward, simple answers, right? And these take, like, they do take 40, 50, hours of of trying to explain it. Like, I mean, and Vervaeke does that exact thing, right?
Yeah.
Like he outlines an entire history of ideas. He then tells you about 4E cognitive science, and like how like the different fields, which psychology is actually among them. He lists psychology in cog sci, and then starts talking about a method that he thinks might work by deconstructing, what both sides of this look like, and even then, it may not work.
Yeah. And
So
you hit on something really important there too. Is God, here we are wrestling with the concept of meaning and life, the meaning in life, and
mhm.
we're not even trying to solve. We might be trying to solve problems that are relevant. There we go, solving problems relevant to our everyday lives.
Mhm.
But I don't know how long you've been wrestling with this, but I've been wrestling with it since 2018. That's when I really started wrestling with the existential, is 2018. So, we're here like almost 4 years later, and, I don't think we're anywhere near, I don't feel that I'm anywhere near, or I don't think I'm anywhere near. I don't think my finger's quite right on the problem.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean,
But I would say that my finger may not be anywhere near the problem, let's say, but I would say that, by having this conversation, trying to move the thinking forward.
it's all we can do sometimes.
Yeah,
It's all we
because,
can do.
we might have a breakthrough that might actually take what Peterson on one hand and Vervaeke on the other, and what they're doing, and might be able to bring it down from there to like something here that we can actually wrestle with, that's
Well, yeah.
tangible and more easily understood. Because
Yep.
you're right, that these aren't straightforward topics, like, at all. There's nothing straightforward about this. It's
I
like,
would say it's straightforward to a point. It just takes. There's a lot of tedious, long drawn out work in order to understand it, because you just can't sit there and give a 5 minute rundown of this topic. Like you just like, I'm sorry, I don't think you can.
no,
It takes time.
and one of the reasons I think that it does take time, and here's why I say it's not straightforward.
Mhm.
We don't even have a consensus on where meaning comes from.
Agreed.
You have one half of an argument that says that we create meaning. That's Vervaeke's argument. We create meaning. Peterson and Frankel said no, meaning manifests itself to you. You just have
Yeah.
to be bloody aware enough of it to see it.
Yes. Yes. You have to be able to pay attention, and even then, like paying attention isn't just like paying attention, right? Like it's to pay attention in and of itself is actually its own system, right? Because if you take it from like Buddhism or something like that, like you're you're trying to reframe your state of being, essentially,
Mhm.
right? You're not trying to just be. It's what is it?
It's
It's
like
a have versus to be.
yeah, it's like trying to develop your own personality. And see, this is another
Exactly.
thing where I think Peterson and Vervaeke, or at least I don't agree with Vervaeke about this, that he says your personality is what you're born with. That it's your character
Yeah.
that you build.
I
I don't
mean,
agree with that, because there's elements to personality that, yes, that are biologic. Your temperament, neuroticism, extroversion is part of that. I would say conscientiousness is not a trait that's easily understood. I would say the orderliness aspect is probably
mhm,
biologic, but I'd say the industriousness aspect of that is something that is probably socially learned. Same thing with agreeableness, politeness, and
mhm.
compassion. I would say compassion, you might be born with an an inborn, what would you say, an inborn proclivity toward be compassionate toward others, based on your mirror neurons in your brain that facilitate empathy. That's where your compassion comes from. But agreeableness, I think, is highly socialized. Openness, we don't and when I say we, I would say that psychology isn't exactly 1%. on consensus of how openness is even developed as part of the personality.
Yeah.
Because yes, your general cognitive ability, your IQ is something that you're kind of born with based on whatever your neural developmental patterns are going to be. But I would say your appreciation for art, music, and things of that nature is something that you might have, again, another inborn predisposition or proclivity toward, but it also has to be fostered socially. So like somebody's got to support you to want to be creative if that's what you want to be, because you can tamp creativity out of somebody pretty easily. So is personality something you're born with, or is it something that is cultivated, or is it both? And this is why I think personality is both.
Mm-hmm.
And so
what does he mean by character?
I think that's the aspects of yourself that you do learn socially. That you do, right? Like you can make yourself more conscientious in a degree that you can make yourself more ordered. You can schedule your time. You can try to work a little bit harder. You can try to find something that in that you can be responsible for, that you can manifest a little bit of meaning, or you can create a little bit of meaning for, meaning that, and what I mean by that is it's like, okay, well, again, it goes back to that conversation we had earlier on your show about, okay, embrace the suck. You don't really want to do this, but you can find something you can be like, look, honestly, whoever assigned this task to me is expecting me to do this. They're counting on me. So if you have any sense of like dutifulness at all, you're not going to just what would you say? You're not going to just let that person down. You're going to try to actually just get through the bloody task that you don't want to do because you don't want to let that person down. So you're kind of duty bound to that. And that could also be mediated by politeness. It's just polite to do what you're asked to do, no matter how bad it might be. But the thing is it really character and personality being separate, or are they actually the same thing, as empirically we've been able to measure with the big 5 dimensions? And so it's like, okay, is Vervaeke, is it part of his own grammar, his own vocabulary, and how he's presenting these ideas, or is it we're confused about the difference between character and personality, or are we conflating the are we splitting the same thing between two different terms here?
Yeah, I would say because later on he gets into the idea of system of the person in the future is what pulls you into, is what helps you transcend, right? Pulls the person in the present, like, I think we can hear this in Peterson a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Pulls the person in the present forward.
Yeah, it's what are you
Right.
aiming at that you want to be? Who do you want to
Yep.
be? And then who do you
Yep.
not want to be? And so you're running toward who you want to be and running away from who you don't want to be. And you're doing that at the same time to maximize your motivation and move forward in the world.
I mean, what I would say is, character. So I won't speak on behalf of Reiki. I guess I'll just say
No,
this.
this is
Like, I
just
would agree
kind of
with you.
those
Like,
things that I've been
person,
thinking about.
yeah, it's like personality and character, I think are interconnected at some level. Whether or not it's like one or two, like, I think it doesn't matter. We'll just look at the entities together, right, and group them, and maybe it's a bad categorization or something like that. But I don't necessarily think so, because in a way, it helps us understand where we come from, right? Like, we can see the patterns of our personality, and then we can, maybe character is developing an engine by which we can improve upon, right? But again, if I improve my character, I'm pulling my personality along with me. If I'm transcending and I'm transforming myself, and I enter into flow states, and I'm able to do it consistently, and I reach higher levels of consciousness, and I'm able to achieve relevance realization, or whatever that is, right? I'm essentially pulling all aspects of myself forward. And at the end of the day, like, it's going to change.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's where I would stand on that.
Okay.
Now, excuse me. Um, I Where did you hear the character personality thing
I want to
from?
say it was either in episode 5 or at the end of the Platonic, or it's in the beginning of the Aristotle. It's either in Plato or Aristotle. I just cannot
Okay.
remember precisely.
Okay, yeah, you're good.
Moment.
You're good. I have some stuff in my notes, and I'm like, I don't remember that.
Well, me being, specialized in personality, it's just one of those things that your ears just kind of perk up. It's like, okay, I'm going to listen to this and be like, well, I don't know if I agree with this exactly.
Yeah.
And then, it's like, so John Paul Sartre thought that we created meaning because we create the world. It's our perceptions that make the world. That pretty much his idea is if you're not alive, there is no world. Because you're not perceiving it. You have to be in the world to perceive it for the world to be real, and therefore meaning isn't something that manifests in so much as it's something that you create. And Yalom harken back to this vacation he took where he was snorkeling and he was watching the corals and the fish and all this, and he realized that it's like, he had this moment where he's like, wow, this is really peaceful and meaningful. He's like, then he became aware that, like, well, the fish don't know that they're in this beautiful landscape, and the corals don't realize there's all this blue water and all different colored fish around. And so therefore meaning wasn't something that was necessarily metaphysically real, but was something that was created by one's own perception of things. But
so I think it's interesting because I think we're kind of leaning into the four ways of knowing.
Okay.
A little bit, right? And especially when it comes to meaning, because so real quick, there's four ways of knowing. Are participatory, so like I participate in something and so therefore I know it. Like, this is the simplest way to put it. Yep. Rituals, traditions, some all that fun stuff. Procedural knowing. I'm always a little shaky on that one. But
it's procedural learning. If you have, let's say you have a procedure to do something for you to learn.
Yes.
Okay, so you're learning the procedure of how this goes. Now you can do that through verbalization, you can do it through memorization, or you can do it through acting it out.
Yes.
But when you're
acting it out would be participation.
But if it's a new skill, let's say for example, let's say you're a new factory worker, you're being put on an assembly line. So you have to learn how to use the equipment. Now you can listen to somebody tell you how to do that. You can memorize the instructions verbally. You can do it mentally. And then you do it through repetition. But the part of the repetition is you have to act it out to build that repetition through repetition. So you could almost make the argument that participatory and procedural knowing tend to happen at the same time, or they can piggyback off of one another. Because you have to learn the damn procedure to act it out, but you also learn it by acting it out, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so here's how I have it in my notes. And again, like I had to take notes because I'm not the smartest guy in the room. So it starts off at the lowest levels is participatory knowledge, right? And participatory, then participation goes into perspectival, which we haven't hit yet, but that's like what you perceive, right? That's like typically data in some regards can create perspectival knowledge, right? And then we have procedural, and then we have propositional. And propositional knowledge is that's like science, right? Like the hard scientific facts. That's propositional. Let me make sure I achieve this. Oh yeah, what do you know? It's funny when you go back through your notes and you see things and you're like, talking about that again. So, like, for example, we were talking about salience earlier. What do you think that goes with?
Well, I know that salience is defined as a state of being important and conspicuous. And so the importance of, say, like a given statement, for example, is the importance of that statement is an example of the salience of that statement. So salience and importance kind of go hand in hand.
It's a salience landscape. It's linked to your salience landscape.
Okay.
And so, so you have different things. And hang on, procedural. I'm trying to find something a little bit more concrete with the procedural stuff. Because that's one that for some reason that's my weakest one. Like when I look at some of this.
Well, I mean, it's not obvious, or at least it doesn't seem obvious what procedural knowing is. Unless,
Yes.
okay, so if you're saying at the lowest form, it's participatory, right? So you're having to, you could make an argument that it's, God,
I wouldn't make an. I'll be careful with that because participatory knowing is the foundation of actually knowing things. It's that same idea that Nietzsche puts out there, right? I look into a mirror and, or like I'm reflecting ideas or something like that versus actually knowing those ideas, right? If I know those ideas, I've participated. I have I have this experience with them, and that's why like shaking off participatory knowing and that perspectival knowing that it cascades into is so hard to shake off, right? Because if I know for a fact that I survived because a god behind the bush said he's not going to eat me today, right? I'm going to worship that god, and that's like a perspectival. Actually, I would say that it goes in. Actually, okay, maybe that helps us understand procedural.
okay,
because now I have a procedure, right, in which I start going through, and then that leads to propositional knowledge, regardless of whether or not it's true or not.
no,
Right?
yeah. I was just going to go with the person where you said the lowest order of learning is participatory. I wonder if I was going to pose that perhaps that's the same thing as the orienting reflex or habituation, is that once you're in an environment and you start acting out things to orient yourself in that environment, you're acting out procedural knowing or participatory knowing because you're in this environment, you're trying to orient to it.
Yeah, and so it again, it's like events process is what I have for procedural. So like it's process driven procedural, of course. But participation is throughout these things. Like you're participating in these procedures. You're and what's interesting about participation is you're actually, in a way, like you are participating with others too, right? And so like you run the gambit of the individual and the community, and that's how you like you go into participating in these things and perspectival and procedural knowing and then propositional knowing. So hopefully we didn't completely screw that up, but if not, we can do another episode and we can fix it.
This is us trying to sort this kind of stuff out, it's kind of interesting how we were able to, you looked at Yalam's experience with the scuba diving, was able to make that connection. Because basically what I've got, and I'm not finished with the book yet. I think I'm about maybe close to halfway, a little over a quarter of the way through it. So Yalam makes this claim that it's not so much trauma that disrupts, when it comes to disrupting psychosexual development, that causes anxiety, but it's actually death anxiety. It's an unconscious death anxiety that drives anxiety. It's like an ultimate awareness of a problem drives anxiety, that drives defense mechanisms, and it's the pathological defense mechanisms that make up like the disorders that you usually treat in therapy. So the two defense mechanisms is the ultimate protector. That's, you could think of that as when someone acts out that defense against death anxiety is someone who gets really attached to other people and makes them this protector of them against death and against all these terrible, tragic things that can happen in life. And the other one is perceived invulnerability or invincibility. And this is you could say that is the person who goes out of their way to be so self-sufficient that they don't make connections with other people because it's their own invincibility and their own self-sufficiency that helps them cope with the unconscious death anxiety.
Yeah, and that goes to like alienation. Yeah, there's so much there, and I'm trying to like not I don't want to spoil it for you, man. Like, because
No,
I think you're
no,
gonna
but
watch this and you're gonna be like,
no.
damn.
Well, you guys think I'm taking
Mm-hmm.
maps of meaning
Yeah.
and all and the mythological aspects
Yeah.
of life and of being, right? I think I have a pretty good grasp on that.
Yeah.
You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I've got a decent grasp on that.
No, I would say you have a good grasp.
Okay, and then so then I started. Then there's Vervaeke coming in with all of this awakening from the meaning crisis, this crisis of
Mm-hmm.
nihilism that's in our culture. He calls it a lack. He calls it meaninglessness. I call it nihilism. It's the same bloody thing.
Mm-hmm. It is.
Okay, and then you have Frankel, who thought that meaning is what sustains you in life and gets you through life and helps you with all the
Mm-hmm.
different things in life. Frankel did a lot of psychotherapy with people who were dying, terminally ill patients, and he would point to things in their life about, okay, well, what about this? What did this mean to you? Could this make your life seem more fulfilling than what you initially presupposed that it was?
Mm-hmm.
Now, Rollo May, who was an existential psychologist, wrote an article condemning Frankel as an authoritarian, saying it's not for the doctor to point out and tell a patient what's meaningful. It's up for the patient to figure that out for themselves. And to sit
Mm-hmm.
there and I haven't read any of Rollo May's work, so I'm not going to sit here and condemn a person based on their condemnation or say their criticism of someone like Frankel. But Rollo May presupposed that the reason why Frankel took this, I can give you something that's meaningful or tell you something that's meaningful, is that basically he took that authoritarian perspective on meaning either as a consequence of or had it before, and it was only cemented by his experience in the camps at Auschwitz and Birkenau and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
But Frankel, I think, if I remember from Answers for Meaning correctly, Frankel wasn't all about creating meaning. Frankel was about finding it where meaning that it manifests itself to you. You just have to figure out where the hell to look for it.
Or you have to pay attention, right? You have to pay
That's the
attention
paying
to
attention part. Yeah.
because maybe I my terminology I would use for instead of manifest is it's revealed to you, right? It reveals itself because it in a way it comes up automatically in your salience landscape. Like it automatically is able to do that, and you're able to pay attention to it and see it once it comes up into your purview. And the way to achieve that is okay. So in the procedural aspect, right, the affordance of it is through like mindfulness, for example,
Yeah.
or something to that effect, where you're able to pull yourself out and see the tiny grain, like the universe in a tiny grain of sand, but able to see everything or as much as possible and center yourself in both. And there's two axes here, right? One axis is transparency in opacity, right? So how much like I can see in that, and then it is the community, the gestalt,
Mm-hmm.
and the individual, the ego.
See, it's funny. This is another thing I've never. I think that I find confusing about Vervaeke's use
Mm-hmm.
of the word gestalt is supposed to mean one's perceptions, because
Hmm.
well, Gestalt psychology was predicated on people's perceptions and how they perceive things. There's a lot of different experiments in that their Gestalt and their perception. And that I learned that from reading The Story of Psychology by Morton Hunt, he wrote this really interesting book on the history of psychology, and in 2007, or at least that's when the revised edition came out. And Fritz Perls, who was the founder of Gestalt therapy, you know, when he would do therapy with somebody, it wasn't necessarily talking about someone's problems and trying to ask them questions to figure out solutions, but he would watch how a person, he would look at their posture. He would pay attention to what they were looking at, or what they were doing, and then he'd ask them, well, why are you doing your arms this way, or why are you shifting in your chair? So his idea was, not only do you have to kind of talk to a person, but you have to make them aware and be able to perceive their own actions in their body, and, you know, bringing movements, like, for example, you lean in your chair. Fritz Perls would be like, well, why are you leaning back? Are you aware that you're doing this?
Oh yeah, I'm aware. I was just thinking about it.
But you know, that was part of that the patient's gestalt, is their perception and awareness of what they're doing and why they're doing what they're doing.
Well, and maybe it's somewhat right, because it's looking at the community, right? And that, unfortunately, is participatory and perspectival in more ways than one.
Okay.
Because you like, I can only perceive things about you, right?
Yes.
And like for the most part, I can perceive things about you, versus you making propositions or procedures. Like you can't make a procedure about me. That's weird. But we can participate though.
Oh, Heimlich
And
made a procedure.
what?
The Heimlich maneuver. Heimlich. He was
That
able to
totally
make a
works.
procedure from himself.
That totally works. But at the end of the day, though, like, we have, like, I don't think his definitions are far off, but they are definitely, like, trying. And this is just some people, like, I try to explain their idea. I try to explain it in their words, because then I think I can understand it better. And, like, this is not easy.
No, it's
Like,
not.
it really isn't easy.
No.
So
Yeah, it's like I'm coming. Like I maybe this is where I'm getting it wrong, is because you can tell I'm definitely, like, I make no bones about it. I'm mostly self-taught. Like, my master's degree was completely online through, okay, here's a pre-recorded lecture, here's the readings, write a paper.
Yep.
And so I would go get other materials, other books, and read through that to expand on that.
Yep.
And so, could that be the reason why I'm off the mark sometimes, or is it just,
that's the reason why, like, we could both be off the mark? Because at the end of the day, we're taking a lecture class, right, or a series of books, and I think it kind of alludes to some of these stuff, because, like, there's a, like, you could do it. You can be what is it, an autodidact? But the problem is, with an autodidact, there's problems associated with teaching yourself.
Yeah, because
typically speaking. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you're right. There is a problem with basically teaching yourself, or being what you called an autodidact, is because just because you're reading it and you think you comprehend it, but you could be way the hell off.
And that's why we need participatory, like, in some cases, like, this is like a procedure, right? Because it allows us to go. So, like, it's a lot different if I actually went to a class with Vervaeke, or I went to a class with Jordan Peterson, which will be freaking awesome, right?
Yeah.
Because then, like, we're participating in this thing together, and that's related to realness, right? Like how real something is, because I'm participating with you, just like I would say this is relatively real, right? We're participating in trying to, prune these branches together. We're struggling, right? But this is
trying to learn this so that way we can apply it and act it out.
Exactly. But this is better, though, than doing it on our own, because even though we're not afforded the traditions, some of the, the dogma, or whatever the case may be,
we're not able to be in the classroom, so it's not like we have, like, Vervaeke to sit there and be like, no, you're way the hell off. Or maybe you're just off a little bit, and all we got to do is kind of we need to tweak something to get you here, or we need to tweak something here to get there.
Yep.
And so here we are. We're wrestling with these ideas, and It's like a very
and then trying to combine them or trying to bring them together, that's a whole nother thing on itself.
oh yeah, absolutely.
Like
That
like like even if I'm the Vervaeke expert and you're the Peterson expert, right? Like even then, like this is rough. But they
well,
both talk about the same thing.
well yeah, and
And there's a
it is
lot of
especially
overlap.
rough too because it's like and this the it correct me where I'm wrong.
Yeah, go ahead.
But it seems to me like Peterson and Vervaeke are the two major influences on you as far as like existentialism and existential philosophy. Is that correct?
Um, I don't know. I would say I'm heavily influenced by both of them.
Okay, I just
Um,
because
yeah, I would say right now, like that's a very salient call.
okay. So for me, I'm like I've got Frankel. There's
Mhm.
we haven't even got to like Nietzsche or Kierkegaard yet, or even Heidegger. So
And all of those are influenced by
they're part of the genealogy of ideas that lead up to Vervaeke and Peterson. And then there's
oh yeah.
Irvin Yalom, who I had never heard of until I took those counseling
Mhm.
classes in that counseling program. That thank Christ I'm not doing those anymore. Um, so and then there's Carl Jung, who's I made the argument that I think he became more existentially oriented in his later works.
Mhm.
That's just a claim, and it's not like I'm saying that it's true. It's just there's patterns that I'm seeing that are part of that, like the meaning in life, according to Jung, and that development of personality is to develop your personality, to be able to be a developed personality in the world rather than just
Mhm.
being a non-developed, basically being a player character in the world rather than just being a non-player character or an NPC in the world.
Exactly. And that's achieved through in many ways through like wisdom frameworks, right? Um, traditions, procedures, some propositions of these things, but even then, those propositions, I think, they change at some level. Um, what's up? What are you thinking?
Archetypes.
Mm-hmm. So,
That's what
are
that
you attributing the archetypes to propositional knowledge?
I'm attributing participatory knowledge and maybe even procedural to a degree to archetypes. Because what are archetypes? They're what I think of archetypes. I think of patterns of behavior that could be embodied and act out, but they're not just they're not just random patterns of behavior. They're patterns of behavior that are archetypal because they're categorized essentially. Like you
Hmm.
being a father, that's an archetypal
Yep.
procedural and participatory process. So you're
Hmm.
acting out an archetype because what you're doing to be a father is what you learned from your father that learned it from his father and his father and his father,
Hmm.
right? So patterns of behavior that are predicated under the category of father, that's an archetype.
Yeah, and that's what
And so
I
that
guess I would say that can be propositional in nature
but you're
because
still
you're aggregating it.
you're yeah, so you could okay, we can make the argument then that archetypes are both propositional. You could also make the argument that they're perceptible. I don't know if that's the right word. What
I would keep it to the upper three.
no,
Propositional, procedural, and perceptive.
perceptive, procedural, and propositional.
Yeah, like I would say participation is like the way we're talking about it now. It is up here in the top three.
Okay.
Like if we were because even though we can participate in it, like we're talking about it from I guess maybe this propositional position. Um,
We can propose.
yeah,
So we can propose by calling archetype father.
or maybe it's all four of them. Who knows?
See that's what I was getting at. Okay, so if we can perceive, so we can propose father.
Hmm.
So if we say So if we're going to propose father, as in, okay, the proposition is that, you're going to be a father, right? That would be in the, like, when Casey was pregnant stage.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the proposition, you're going to be a father. Perceptive, right?
Yeah.
So that would be the next one, right? Okay, so you've perceived and looked at, okay, how your father acted out the patterns of behavior that made him father. So that would be that perceptive. Procedural, that's where you break down the patterns of behavior into individual acts or individual behaviors that you could embody and act out. So then that goes into that whole the whole, that's the participatory. So the procedural would be like being able to
Yeah.
break down the pattern of behavior to individual behaviors and then acting that out or implementing that. That's that participatory part of that. So perhaps maybe archetypes really are those patterns that encompass all four of those levels of knowing simultaneously, in a sense.
So in from some of the Vervaeke lectures, he talks about, like, I think this is actually in episode 3. He mentions this, that myths, albeit are not necessarily true all the time, they do offer perennial, like, patterns. Okay, so once we hear perennial patterns or patterns, we think perspectival, right? Now over time, those can become propositional, but the, one of the things that it kind of just dawned on me is, so one of the major issues with the meaning crisis is because for so long we had, let's say, archetypes, right? Myths, dreams, all these things kind of forming our world. We, once math was introduced into this, like really Descartes and the Cartesian and like Cartesian thinking, like that's where it starts. And now you are ripping apart the not procedure, but the perspectival knowing. You're just ripping it apart because it's an illusion. It's not true. The math doesn't work if we're the center of the universe. The math does work if we're orbiting the sun. And so we're competing in some regards
So
with that.
so the meaning crisis is a response between this conflict between science and religion.
In a way, yes.
Well,
In a massive
they are
way.
conflicting because you have, on one hand, you have science, you have mathematics, you have the objective world. And so because you have the objective world, you have this rationality, or maybe this radical rationality, right? This is what Nietzsche talked about when he said rationality falling in love with itself.
Exactly.
This is the same thing that Milton talked about with Lucifer, that once you think you know everything you need to know, then you don't need the transcendent. And therefore, when you turn your back from the transcendent, you automatically occupy hell, in a sense, because you're removed from the transcendent. So you're stuck in the objective world with no transcendence whatsoever.
Yeah, you're in a way, you're, and this also gets to another idea that we're talking about too, is like how we perceive time and stuff like that, and if it's circular or if it's transformative in some regards too, as we move through modes of being without crap. You said transform. No, it wasn't transformative. You said something else. It was supernatural. You said something to deal with super. What's the word you used? Well, yeah.
Where was I talking about? Was I talking about Milton, Paradise Lost, and
Yeah. So rationality keeps you in hell, right?
yeah, you fall.
And without that, you can't. Okay, it's
Transcendence.
Yeah, transcendence. Yeah. So you can't achieve transcendence just on rationality alone, because we've or intelligence in this regard. Like, I don't think rationality is the right way to look at it, because rationality just
it's like totalitarian presupposition. What you know is sufficient enough to say that you know everything in totality, right? And that's and you could say, and that's why I said radical rationality.
Mm-hmm. So and that's the thing, when you, and that is where we start to break down, I think, in meaning, right? Because we let's throw this all the way back to shamans, right?
Mm-hmm.
Shamans are a major shaman and pattern recognition in the human mind is probably one of the biggest evolutionary advantages we've ever had. Just because like over the past few thousand years, it's what's caused this massive growth, right? And the total existence of humanity. So we sit here and we start looking at patterns, and whether it's with psilocybin or not, we start looking at patterns and we find these perennial patterns, which then become propositional knowledge, which is useful to a point, right? And then all of a sudden we start to question those things and we become more enlightened, right, to the fact that it is not that it's not real, right? And I think we even see this in Buddhist teaching, like this is not real, like it in some regards, even though it's more metaphysical. And now we have this conflict arising between these perennial patterns, which are codified in essentially myth,
Mm-hmm.
right? Myth and religion, and the hard propositional knowledge of science, right? And again, we're not trying to make an enemy out of either one.
No, we like Piaget trying to bring the science and the religion together, so that way they're not at odds, but they're actually at one with one another.
Yep.
They're
And
chiral.
so
They're chiral from to borrow a term from chemistry. They're chiral. They lay on top of one another almost in a mirror fashion. Because it goes back to what Willem Freehoff said about embodied belief, that what you believe is what you act out, and even Durkheim with religious is an action rather than religious. Religious is a social action rather than just some form of divine providence or divine intervention. And so you could say that the what we see in the objective world can be reflections of the mythological or the religious world in a sense, because there are things that are because it's like Peterson said, religious truth isn't necessarily scientific truth, but it's true enough that it works within that objective framework, or that Darwinian framework.
well, that's like in some cases biological. We'll call it like biological truth for our fun, right?
Yeah. You can look at it that way, or the biology is a genuine reflection of the metaphysical or the mythological or the religious.
Yeah, and the issue, I guess the issue with knowing all the propositional knowledge from a scientific perspective, or having, I guess, that arrogance, right? Because that's more appropriate. There's an arrogance associated with that it puts you in a stasis, and you can no longer transcend. Like it's one side of the equation now that doesn't always help, because you can run into a combinatorial explosion.
Mm-hmm.
Like what that is for example, I need to improve my efficiency in some field, right?
Yeah.
And so I have a bunch of data points, and then all of a sudden I have an unsalient data point, like the position of a Mars rover to the sun of some distant Andromeda planet, right? It's like completely irrelevant. And so that's kind of something that we're dealing with. It's and again, and that's why we also go back to the idea of don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Exactly. And I would hope that, let's see, we've been at this, just out of curiosity here, about an hour.
About an hour.
Okay. Do you feel like we've gotten anywhere closer
To what?
I guess I would say closer to seeing if there's any clear understanding of this at all, or making
I would
sense of
say we've done a very good job of muddying the water.
it.
But it's necessary in in some ways, like 'cause the only way you can clean your room sometimes is to make a mess.
Yeah,
Talk about like a metaphorical truth. Like I can't clean my room if with a
you
I can't
can't.
clean a dirty room without getting messy again.
Yeah,
Um, and I would say that one of the big challenges again is looking at the story, right? One, I think there we can look at it just like we can solve it at the human level, right? We can look at that that history of humanity, but we can also apply that to we can apply that to humanity, and then we can look at the tools that we have available and maybe get the best picture possible. But even then, it's not going to be perfect, and that's okay.
okay.
But meaning maps of meaning and awakening from the meaning crisis, I think in some ways are talking about some of the same things. I think one is focused like they have different names, right?
Okay. So different aims. Okay. So
Yeah.
or maybe they have the same aim. They're just coming at it from different directions, because the idea is, what's a meaningful life that's going to make
Mhm.
things better. So through
Yes.
Peterson, it's aiming high, working toward a better outcome for yourself, that it's not just working for you, but it works for those around you, right? Because because you have to think you're a community unto yourself.
Hmm.
You're part of a community, or at least part of a family that's also part of a community. But you
Yep.
can't just start making radical changes at the highest level of analysis, at the community level, and you can't really make changes at the family level until you make changes
Hmm.
at the individual level. So, and I think Vervaeke's coming at it from a sense of, okay, how did we get to this point? We have to investigate how we got here, and then what can we do about it? Where Peterson's like, okay, look, you're not everything that you could be, but you could be something. You could be more than what you are, but you have to figure out what that is, and then you have to take the responsibility to for yourself to make that happen, to make that manifest, make that reveal itself, whatever the better you could be. Whereas Vervaeke goes through the complete history of how we got to the meaning crisis, and then how we can try to awaken from the meaning crisis, so that way we don't occupy hell. And that again, that goes back to the same aim, different ways of doing things, and that's the avoidance of nihilistic hell.
I, I would agree with you,
Or
and then I would
is that an oversimplification?
it might be. I think a distinction needs to be made with Vervaeke. Um, I'm sure there's could be a better distinction made with Peterson. Are they trying to solve a meaning crisis? Yes, like absolutely. Like I think like that's the common ground. Like that's what they're aiming at. Now, where I think the difference here is, I think Peterson in some ways is more abstract. Um, and looking at the metaphysical substrate, right?
The metaphorical
The metaphorical substrate, right? Which definitely is a mechanism, right? Vervaeke is looking at a methodology, right? That in a way tries to achieve the same result over and over again for everyone as well.
So it's more like he's looking at he's looking at a particular method
Yeah, he's trying to achieve a method. I think a systematic, repeatable method
that's
for
measurable, that works from
for
from a scientific perspective. So is it and I could be barking up the wrong tree here, but
Yeah.
is it almost like, oh God, I'm going to probably step in some bear traps here,
Go
but
ahead.
Fine, why not?
That's what comments are for.
It can't sound any dumber than it already does, or I can't sound any dumber than I already have in any past conversation. So if Vervaeke's looking for a particular methodology that can be measured and it's reliable and it's valid, then it's almost like he's taking steps to solve the problem that Sam Harris proposed. And that is finding a way that science can determine human values in a meaningful way.
Too far.
Way too far, so that's way up.
Too far.
So
I think we had to pull it several steps back.
Okay, so I definitely barked up the wrong tree.
No, but I think that's a good way to kind of like orient it, right? Because like he's not Sam Harris. He's not saying like here's the moral landscape or like
no, but it's the closest thing we have to say like the idea that you can use science to determine a value that's meaningful.
Well, the at the end of the day though, it's about incorporating different tools and stuff like that from maybe a secular perspective, maybe not as much woo-woo associated with religion, and trying to maybe it's not scientific, but maybe it's synthesizing as well. It may be synthesizing some of this stuff because he's pulling in a lot of like the eightfold path. He's pulling in agape, which you'll get into later, and like agape is not a scientific subject, like it really isn't. And so he sees these as psychotechnologies, right? And how we use these psychotechnologies to solve certain problems. Now, because it's not there's science in there, right? Especially with cognitive science and stuff like that. Like there is science in there, but I would say that even then, the propositional knowledge of science isn't enough because that's just intelligence. It's just general intelligence.
Yeah,
which doesn't solve the problem.
It's IQ in general cognition, and all it does is predict how well and how fast you learn things.
And then the only thing that I would say that maybe the only thing that's scientific here is how to achieve the flow state on a more consistent basis.
How to occupy that perfect place that's meaningful, the proper balance between chaos and order, as Peterson would say.
Yeah. And that can be talked about that way too, but it like from a scientific perspective, I think that's what he's trying to achieve is that flow state. That everybody. How do I get to flow state?
And then everybody could achieve a flow state, then everybody would have meaning, and therefore the meaning crisis would be not necessarily cured, but I would say that it would be
blunted because it doesn't always mean that because you get into a flow state that you find that perfect one-to-one match for meaning. I mean, there's several things, and unfortunately, like how do I word this? Because I don't want to simplify this too much, right? I don't want to get, I'll bark down the wrong tree right now.
Hey, apparently
at some level it's taking responsibility. Like that is the number one. Like we know, we think we know what that is. Like that is taking responsibility. Now, how does one take responsibility? That's another question. And then it's a trial and error process that you may or may not get to. And it's just, it's a rough thing.
Yeah, it definitely is. And maybe I was, well, you said I went too far, so maybe I was barking at the right tree, but instead of barking at
Yeah.
the base of the tree, I was like jumped up into several branches, barking up at the top of the tree instead of being.
That's accurate. I think there is a scientific method, like a repeatable method he's trying to achieve, right?
Yes.
The issue though with meaning is it is
You can't really measure it. The only way that you could really, I think the only way that you could actually measure meaning is fulfillment. How fulfilled are you? And then
but even then that could be
it's self-report because it's subjective. You know, what might be fulfilling for one person may not be fulfilling for someone else. And so then,
and you can have self-deception.
and yeah, that's the thing is the self-deception, the bullshitting yourself, as he puts it.
Like and so like I have to like I think maybe make this like a requirement for me to kind of go through every, you know, I did it back in January. I went through the 50 hours, and so I probably will do it again here soon because it's not a book, but it's 25 hours of fun for me. 50 hours for most people because I listen at twice the speed. Probably why I suck so bad today. But
No, I think
there's just so much
for
better.
one, it's like, yeah, you're going from interviewer getting information from somebody to now we're having a conversation about a topic that's far more complicated than just tell me about your life and what you find meaningful.
Oh yeah. But
this isn't like this isn't an easy task of trying to sort out.
no, and that's what we said earlier, right? Meaning crisis, solving this or something like that. Like, and that's the thing that technology doesn't, like the scientific propositions of technology doesn't actually help all the time.
No.
With that, like it really makes it worse. Because now you can sedate yourself, you can have self-deception, like there's all these things that are occurring that feed into these parasitic processes, right? For example, likes or whatever the case may be, like these are things are like dopamine hits.
And all of that, and how many
Exactly.
And most people want to keep the positive comments, and they want to do away with the negative comments, and that doesn't do anybody any bloody good whatsoever.
Then you have assholes.
Yeah, you do have antisocial types, and then you have the narcissistic types that are relishing in all the good comments. And so, you know, you have to account for every single one of these variables, and it's very difficult to do.
Yep. And even then it's a process, and trying to make sure that these ideas are portrayed accurately is also difficult.
Yeah, because I mean, even the idea of archetype isn't necessarily something that's straightforward.
No,
It's very
no,
complicated. You know, I don't know how, I don't know. As far as I know, I have never heard another person think of archetypes as patterns of behavior that are embodied and act out. Like that precise verbiage. Now,
I mean, but they're perennial.
Okay,
pattern.
So I would say that at least if nothing else, I would say if nothing else through this process of this conversation, we've been able to at least have a better conceptualization of what would you say is what happens when you get the four
ways of knowing.
4 ways of knowing when they're encapsulated in one at once. I would say if anything, if anything has been accomplished, we've been able to conceptualize the four ways of knowing when they're you can tell I'm getting tired.
No, yeah, and it's a tiring subject too. Like at the end of the day,
when you've got the 4 ways of knowing being, what would you say, acted out simultaneously or conceptualized simultaneously, that's an archetype.
Yeah. Or yeah. I'll bite on that one. Because that archetype now becomes a proposition in many ways, right? It becomes a propositional knowledge. Like, okay, well, you're this archetype. You're acting this out right now. Why are you acting this out? And then like we can start working on like we can show you how you're doing the process. We can show you how you're participating and how you're being perceived by others, and how you are perceiving your role in this too. And that might be, yeah, I would agree with that. And there's a lot to this.
Yeah.
So
I don't foresee us solving this very quick.
no, I mean, but at the end of the day, humanity's trying to solve this for eons. I guess the issue is science has some ways helped us, right? Because science and philosophy has helped expose, I think, a weakness in how we find and make meaning. And we're trying to, like, here's part of the problem set, right? Is we have to move forward. We can't move backwards. We can't, like, no matter what somebody says, like, well, we should just go back to fundamentals, like, fundamentalism and all that other fun stuff. That's a problem, because now we're more aware of these things, and we have to find a better way to synthesize these aspects of our being, essentially. And it's a long, drawn out process. So
I wholeheartedly agree. I think we're gonna call it there. I think.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
No problem.
Dude.
Yeah.